Hey everybody, version 1.15 of Apache NiFi has already been out for a bit. A lot of you are probably already using it, but I wanted to go ahead and take a few minutes to go over all of the major new features that we've added in 1.15 to make sure that you're not missing out on anything. I'm Mark Payne, and this is what's new in NiFi. So in version 1.15 of NiFi, we've added several new features to really make it a lot easier to build your data flows. So the best way to demo these features is to go ahead and just build a data flow live with you, and we'll demo the features as we use them. So the first thing I'm going to do here is create a new process group for my flow. In this case, we're going to grab some log data from Apache Kafka and push it into an S3 bucket. So we'll create our new process group. And before we get started, we want to go ahead and create a parameter context that we're going to use in order to parameterize all of our processors here. So we can see here that we've already got two parameter contexts created for us. The first one deals with AWS parameters. It has things like my secret key and my access key ID, and the other has some Kafka related parameters, such as the Kafka brokers. So in this case, though, I want to build a data flow that's going to make use of both AWS parameters and Kafka parameters. So I can create a new parameter context here. I'll call it AWS and Kafka. And instead of adding any parameters, I'm just going to come over here to this new inheritance tab. So in version 1.15, we allow you to inherit parameter contexts. So we'll bring both of these parameter contexts over. And so now any of the parameters that are defined in either the AWS parameters context or the on-prem Kafka context are going to be made available through this newly created parameter context called AWS and Kafka. Now, if both of these parameter contexts have a parameter with the same name, let's say they both have a username parameter, the order that they're in this list tells us which parameter value is actually going to get used. So in this case, the AWS parameters context would actually get used, but we could actually drag and drop these and change the ordering in our list here if we want to prioritize one of the other contexts. In this case, I'll go ahead and just keep AWS parameters as my primary here. And then in addition to inheriting these parameter contexts, I can come over here and define parameters that will apply only to this newly created parameter context as well. So here I might want to create a parameter called Kafka topic. And we'll give it a value of request logs. And I'll hit apply. And so now anytime that I use this parameter context, I can reference the Kafka topic parameter, and I can also reference any of the parameters that are defined within my other contexts here. And if I actually come back in here now that I've applied the changes, we can see all of the different parameters that are made available to us, and we can go to one of these in particular if we want to. But now that we've created our parameter context, we can go ahead and assign that to our process group. And we're ready to go. Step into our process group. And first thing that I want to do here is I want to get some data from Apache Kafka. So I'll drag my processor on here. I'll go ahead and filter by consume Kafka. Now in this case, my Kafka broker that I'm running is version 2.6. So I know that I need to use either consume Kafka 2.6 or consume Kafka record 2.6. And specifically this time I'm consuming record-oriented data. So we have a record reader for this log data. So I'm going to go ahead and use the consume Kafka record 2.6 processor. And I'll come in here to configure it. Now for the Kafka brokers, I'm going to go ahead and use my parameter Kafka brokers. For the topic name, again, I'll use a parameter. And we can press Control Space there to auto-complete that for us after we type the pound and curly brace. Now for the record reader, I already have a record reader set up that's going to read our log data for us. And for the writer, I'm actually going to go ahead and convert the data from raw log formats into JSON so that it's easier for our consumers to parse and make sense of the data. ID, I'll call it consume logs. And we will also choose the offset reset as earliest. Now, another great new feature that was added in 1.15 is what we refer to as component verification. And so if you notice, we now have this new icon up here in the top right that says verify properties. So I'll go ahead and click on that, and it's going to pop up a little window that allows me to enter in some flow file attribute values, and I'll demo how that works in a moment, but for now we'll go ahead and just click verify. And what this is going to do is it's going to run all of the normal validation that we get whenever we apply properties, but it does it right here in this window. So rather than having to enter a bunch of property values and click apply, check to see if the processor is invalid. If not, hover over the icon, find out what's invalid, come back and reconfigure it. Now we can eliminate all of that by just clicking this icon here and running the validation. But in addition to that, in 1.15, we've also added the ability for processors to run more sophisticated validation or verification. So in this case, whenever we've entered all of this configuration, we can run our verification, and we don't just verify that things are syntactically correct, but we can actually verify that the configuration makes sense as well. So we can see here that it performed the validation, which is the same thing that we always see from processors. That basically is just ensuring that our syntax is correct. And for this particular processor, consume Kafka record 2.6, it then checks the offsets in Kafka, and it determines that we're currently behind by about 869,000 messages, and it then parses some of those records. So in this case, it parsed 10,000 of those records from the topic to make sure that the record reader that we have configured makes sense in our configuration. So if I were to change the name of the topic now from our parameter, and I just use a topic name like JSON, where I don't expect my log-oriented record reader to work, I can go ahead and click verify again, and we'll see that now it performed the validation and everything is still syntactically correct. It was able to check offsets and determine that we are lagging behind by about 21,000 messages on this particular topic, but we now get a failure whenever we see the parse records. So this just gives us a way to understand the fact that even though everything is syntactically correct, it's probably not configured properly. So we'll go ahead and change this back now to use our parameter for the Kafka topic. And we can apply those changes. So now note, we do still have an invalid indicator on our processor. And if we hover over that, it's going to tell us it's because the success and parse failure relationships haven't been defined. So whenever we run the verification from our properties window here, it doesn't take into effect whether or not the processor is fully connected to other processors in the flow, because we want to be able to run that validation as we're building the data flow. So we ignore those specific validation failures. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and consume those logs from a Kafka topic, and we want to push them to S3. So we can say we're going to use the put S3 object processor. But before we do that, we probably don't want to send a lot of individual messages to S3. We probably want to batch those up. So we'll use a merge record in between. And we'll send a success there. For merge record, we're going to use a JSON reader, because remember the output of our Kafka processor was JSON format. And we will again write it in the JSON format. And we'll say we want to batch up at least 1 megabyte worth of data up to 100 megabytes of data for each file. and we'll set a max bin age of, let's say, 1 minute. And we're going to apply those changes. We'll connect our merged relationship. And we'll configure our put S3. So in this case, for the bucket, we're going to use our logs bucket. And for our credentials, I should already have this defined for me. So we're in good shape here. And now when I click the button to verify my configuration, we see that we don't just get an empty table here. We get options for filling in file name, Java IO temp dir, S3 owner. So all of these are the different attributes or variables that are referenced already within my flow. So whenever we click this button, it's smart enough to go ahead and prompt me to enter values for all of these. But if there are other attributes that I want to enter as well that we're not explicitly referencing within the expression language, but we know the processor will use it. So for example, the MIME type attribute might be used. I could click the add button and add an attribute there as well. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just click verify. I don't really need to enter any of these particular attributes. And we see that all of our verification did check out, so we can go ahead and apply changes. And we see that each of these processors is still invalid due to the fact that we haven't connected all of their relationships. So we can go ahead and configure that now. Now, if you've noticed, in 1.15, there is no relationships tab. This is actually a new feature that's been added to 1.16, which hasn't been released yet, but I'm running on basically a branch that has this as a preview. So we'll have 1.16 out shortly, and we've moved the auto termination of relationships from the settings tab into this new relationships tab. And this gives us the ability to configure retries on these relationships as well. So there's a lot more information about that I'll provide in the next video when we get to the 1.16 features. But in this case, for the parse failure, I'm just going to go ahead and terminate the relationship. For merge record, I'll go ahead and terminate the failure and the original relationships. And for put S3, I will terminate the success and the terminate. And we'll go ahead and choose for failure, I'm going to go ahead and retry up to 10 times. And I'll apply those changes. So now we can go ahead and run our flow, make sure that the data is coming out as we expect. And now we've got some data here. We can go ahead and list the queue. In this case, I'll go ahead and view this particular flow file. And we can actually do formatted and see everything looks as we expected. So this is what the data looked like as it came in. So this is just the common log format that you'll see from any web server. And we've actually used our Grok reader to parse out all of these separate fields. And so we've built up a JSON that has our source IP, user ID, username, timestamp, user agent, all these different fields separated out for us. And everything looks good there. So we'll go ahead and use our merge record to merge these into batches. And we can go ahead and start pushing this data into S3 as well. And now we can see that we've pushed all of our data to S3. Everything's looking pretty good. Next thing that we might want to do is we might want to actually transform the data that we're pushing into S3 before we push it. So if we come in here and we look at the scripted processors, there's a handful of different processors that we've added now on 1.15 as well. There's a scripted filter record, scripted partition, and a scripted validate record. So I'm not going to go too much into how each of these different processors work, but it's worth noting that they are here. They allow us to use scripting like Groovy or Jython to really easily perform a handful of different tasks on these records. So it's really nice to be able to use things like query record to use SQL, and Jolt transform gives us a nice DSL to do all sorts of different structural manipulations to our data, but sometimes it helps to be able to just jump right into a scripting language like Python or Groovy and just write a few lines of code there. So we have a handful of different new scripted processors that allow us to do that for record-oriented data. And of course, if we want to learn more about each of those, we can right-click on it and go to View Usage, and we can come over here to the additional details, and this is going to give us all sorts of information about what the processor does, how it works, the variable bindings, which are the variables that this processor is going to make available to your script. And then it's going to have a handful of examples. So in this case, if we've got this CSV data and we want it to look like this, we can use this Groovy script or this Python script. These docs do a pretty good job of explaining how each of these different processors work, so it should help out quite a bit. And there's also another new processor that was added in 1.15 that's worth mentioning, which is the Execute Stateless processor. And again, I'm not going to go into too many details with this processor either. If you're interested in it, you can go to the View Usage and go to the additional details. But this allows us to build up a data flow using the existing traditional NiFi and then export that data flow using our download flow definition button. And that allows us to then run that data flow actually within the NiFi stateless engine. So if you're not familiar with that, I recommend you take a look at the stateless README. It does a pretty good job of outlining the differences, but it's basically just a different runtime for running a flow that you've built within NiFi. It makes some different trade-offs that make sense in certain situations. And so my last video that I put up on this channel was actually about using Execute Stateless in order to make use of Kafka's exactly once semantics. So if you're interested in the stateless engine or Kafka and exactly once, I certainly recommend you check that out. And finally, it's worth mentioning that there were quite a few different improvements also to NiFi's performance as it relates to the UI and some of that sluggishness that some of you may have been experiencing, especially if you're running a data flow that has thousands of processors or specific process groups that might have hundreds of processors within them. We've made some really good improvements there to significantly reduce the amount of data that we're bringing back to the browser, and that can provide a huge performance improvement in that to eliminate some of that sluggishness. And one other thing that I wanted to mention while we were here, we did demo this new capability to verify the different properties. In this case, it's coming back immediately and showing us that it's not valid because I don't have a record reader and a writer configured. So if I were to configure those, I can click verify, and notice in this case it's not actually even prompting us to provide any sort of flow file attributes because this processor doesn't do anything with those. All that it's going to do is run the default validation. So don't be surprised if you click that button and you don't get the prompt. But for one of these processors that does, it's worth noting that this verify properties can only be run when the processor is stopped. And it's also worth noting that whenever we do run this, we go out and make that connection to the Kafka brokers, and we're pulling that data in order to verify it. The S3 type of processors are going to reach out to S3 and make sure that you're able to interact with the bucket that you have configured. So it's worth noting that that is only going to happen whenever a user clicks this button. It's not going to happen constantly in the background. So you don't have to worry about putting a lot of resource strain on those services, and you don't have to worry about dealing with large bills from S3 because of all of this background polling. None of that's going to happen in the background, only on user demand. And that's all for now. Version 1.15 was a fairly small release, but 1.16 is just around the corner, and that's one you won't want to miss. Version 1.16 is shaping up to be one of the biggest releases we've had in a really long time. So if you want to make sure that you're the first to know about all the new features coming up in NiFi, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Take care.